you have to put in the out loud rehearsal part, even if you feel really stupid doing it. And it doesn't mean learning a script by heart. It just means owning it. Authenticity is practiced and spontaneity is rehearsed.
Hi, I'm 𝗀𝗃𝗁𝗁. In Choices and Chances, I use my own style of interviewing, honed through decades as an international news presenter and correspondent, to delve into a new topic each week and interview some of the most inspiring people in the world. Life is a series of choices that give us chances to live our best lives. My goal is to turn the wisdom of people I talk to and lessons from my own experiences into ideas you can use. So if you'd like to be inspired by others' stories, hit the subscribe button and join the community.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. I really miss Brussels and I miss being in the Brussels bubble in the EU.
So you're the one.
Yes. Oh gosh, do you like living there still after all this time?
No, I love living in Brussels. I mean, it was never our plan to stay as long as we have. I've been here 15 years. When I say we, it was my boyfriend, now my husband, who came 15 years ago for 2 years. And then we had a kid and suddenly bought a house, and then we were Belgian, and, you know, the rest is history. I still meet people who've been here for 25 years and say they're going back to whichever country they originally came from. I do like living here. I do find the EU bubble and how the messaging and the communication around it incredibly frustrating, which I expect you did as a journalist as well, but I do like living here still.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to get into that. Now, I always start with a question that later informs how I introduce the guest. So rather than me picking and choosing the facts about you, who are you and how would you define yourself, both in terms of titles and beyond titles?
Oh, good Lord. Okay, so technically, if you want the sort of purely technical description of who I am and what I do, I'm Laura Shields, and I run a company called RedThread, which is an agency that teaches people who need to communicate in a way that is sort of clear and concrete and compelling, and usually who don't have English as a first language. So I teach them how to talk to journalists. I used to be a journalist myself. I teach them how to do public speaking. I teach them how to put information across in a way that is really sharp and clear and that sort of tries to get people's attention. So in that sense, I'm the managing director, but it's kind of arbitrary. I'm a company of one. I've been running my own business for about 10 years now. And if I was going to describe myself in non-technical terms, I would just say I'm like a rolling ball of hair on fire, to be honest. As in, that's how I tend to just go around with doing things. I feel like I'm spending a lot of the time just bouncing around. So that's kind of probably how I would think about myself. But I appreciate that may not be how others see me.
So Laura is was one of our favorite guests for the show that I had in Brussels at the European Parliament. It's called Raw Politics.
I miss that show.
Yeah, so do I.
From the European Parliament in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Big Brexit day, but which part of it are you watching closely?
I'm actually really interested to see whether Boris Johnson's objectively terrible start to the week has actually made any difference with how he stands in the eyes of ordinary people, particularly those who voted for Leave and are particularly keen to see him push Brexit through.
And Laura is our go-to person for anything to do with messaging or even just analyzing what politicians have said.
Is it all roads leading to a general election now? And is this day one of campaigning pretty much?
I think I don't think this is day one of campaigning, because I think the campaigning's actually started from the Tory hustings back in the summer when he was trying to get the leadership. I think they've been building up to this for a long time.
And it's always fascinating to look behind that, isn't it? And I do want to ask you, first of all, why you made that switch from being a journalist to comms. A lot of journalists struggle with doing that. Why did you do it? And did you struggle?
Okay, so a lot of the time journalists struggle because firstly, they're often a bit older than I was when I did it. And I'll come on to the age I was at and why I did it in a moment. And I also think a lot of journalists are really vocational, actually, about being journalists. Like for them, it's really part of their identity, who they are. They really have that drive to get the story. They really want to be there. Some of them just like the game. Some of them want to get to the truth. Some of them like the excitement. There's all those reasons for it. I never really felt like I had that. So when it came to me to switch, it wasn't like a dramatic, and now I'm leaving journalism and renouncing it. I was 29. I was working at the BBC. I looked at what was ahead of me. I had the choice of whether or not I'd go to Brussels with my husband for 2 years and sort of just try something different, or whether or not I was going to stay. And I looked at what my options were that were still ahead of me at the BBC. And I didn't have enough drive to go either the route to try and get on air or to be somebody who to run a major program. Firstly, we talk about choices and certainty. If you're a news editor, you have to make snap judgments. And I often just didn't have that kind of instinctive, right, this is how we're going to do it. But also I just didn't want it enough. And you know this, but you're in journalism. It's a tough profession. It was a tough profession even before the digital age. You have to really, really want it. And we're not even talking about talent at this point. You just have to know. And I remember, like, in my first job when I worked at CNN, I was really taken aback by how ambitious a lot of my peers were. Not because there's anything wrong with ambition, but because I kind of thought, oh, well, I've now got here, I'll work here for a bit, and then I'll get promoted when it's time, and we'll see what happens. There were people who were going places from day one, and I never had that. So when the time to switch came, it wasn't that much of a wrench, because I didn't feel like journalism was my first passion. It was very interesting, I liked it, but it wasn't really what got me out of bed in the morning. And so if you want the unspun version of the story, when we were moving to Brussels and I didn't really know what I was going to do, I didn't want to go into lobbying. And I really couldn't bear the idea of going to the EU, because I'd worked in institutions all my life and I'd been in very establishment universities and schools. So I was just like, I'm done with this. So and then I thought, well, what am I going to do? So a friend of mine who lived here said, well, why don't you do a bit of freelance journalism and some media training, because you'll make more money. And I said, great idea. What's media training? And that was kind of really. And so it was this, I thought, cool, I'll just sit around, near Schumann roundabout, reading The Economist and drinking coffee, and everybody will give me work, even though I don't know what it is that I'm meant to be doing, and I've never done anything in my life. And fortunately, I did have a bit of an angel who came to help me. So a sort of a fairy godmother who's called Lindsay Williams. And she was actually somebody I worked with at CNBC, the news channel, for a while. And she was running her own media training companies, so teaching people how to talk to people like you or to me. And she came, we had a drink before we moved to Brussels, and she just basically said, look, I think you'll find it hard to do on your own. Why don't you come in with me? I'll train you. You can be my Brussels office, but you get your clients and all the rest of that. And so she really helped me get up and running, but it was still brutal, Tessa, because honestly, all I thought was, I'm going to go from doing this to this. I don't feel like I made any kind of major big decision. And so as a result, I got my first client in 6 weeks. And then I didn't get another one for 6 months. But obviously, when I got my first client in 6 weeks, I was like, yeah, I've made it. I am boss bitch. And then, of course, it fell apart. And so it was a really useful lesson in that sense. So that's my very long answer to it. That's how the switch came. But again, it wasn't like this, and now I am going from one thing to another. It wasn't this sort of decisive moment. It just so happens that 15 years later, I really like where I've ended up more than the place where that I was before. It's not that I'm anti-journalism, but it's not a happy place to be now.
What's clear to me is that you had a very clear idea of what you didn't want. It was, I think that's already half the battle. You didn't know what you wanted, but you knew very well what you did not want. And now you said that journalism wasn't what made you want to wake up in the morning and get going. What is it about communications or media training? It sounds very just straight and square, media training, communications, but what is it about that makes you wake up? Yeah.
So I'm very much like, how do you speak better, basically? And I think that particularly in a town like this, or even in a large number of complex international businesses or organizations, people are obviously very cerebral. They deal with huge amounts of information. Even if they have good political instincts, they often write more than they talk. And they also don't give enough attention to how they speak or understand the impact that the quality of what they say has reputational or brand consequences, both for themselves and commercially. And so the thing that I find exciting, actually, and I don't use that word lightly, I don't get excited about that much, is when you actually spend some time with an organization or an individual and you really help them pull out and sort of define what they need to say and why it matters in about 2 to 3 minutes. And often it's only the external person who can actually really help them find it, because they're so close to the details, or their staff don't have the seniority, their comms people perhaps don't have the seniority to tell them. And so you feel like you're building something and refining it. And because I have a really short attention span, which also probably made me great for broadcast journalism, I'm very good at just sitting with them going, no, no. And so actually it's that kind of, you take the raw elements and you kind of refine and refine and refine. And I really like that, because actually as a journalist, I mean, you've interviewed enough boring people to know that it's not a given. It's not a given that people are great at talking. But most journalists get the finished product, right? So a lot of journalists, you talk about journalists struggling to cross over or to go into communication. I think one of the reasons why a lot of journalists struggle with that is because they don't want to have to do the dirty work of basically chipping away at all the crap, excuse my language, chipping away at all the business nonsense and the jargon and the technical detail, or trying to make something and work it into an interesting story. Like, they don't have the patience for that. They don't want to have to do it. I love that part, because actually one of the things that I really realized when I switched from journalism to media, or teaching people how to talk publicly, is that most screw ups that happen when it comes to communication are usually because people don't have skills or confidence. They're risk averse, or they're incompetent, and they're running around as well with their hair on fire. And that actually there isn't any conspiracy to withhold this great story. It's just that they haven't got their act together. And so what I really like is being able to work with organizations or individuals where you can really make that difference. And often you get very senior people who start treating you like a therapist very quickly. So you get much closer to the story. No, it's great. And people are really indiscreet. I don't know what happens, but it's very different. I know so much more dirt now than I did before I was a trainer. Now, obviously, I couldn't tell you any of this stuff because I would be breaching client confidentiality. But the relationship part is much richer too. Oh, and there's better coffee and nicer hotels than journalists.
I imagine. And, one of my frustrations, actually, you said a lot of the boring interviews. That's a frustration of mine, is because these are smart people. They're intelligent, but a lot of them just don't know how to speak. And it's sad for me being on television, because I only have a 30-second spot for anything they have to say. And if I can't get anything of value in 30 seconds, then your paragraph of whatever you just said goes out the window. And that for me is really frustrating from a wider discourse, public discourse point of view. We've just missed out on his intelligence, on what he's got to share. And from your side, what you can see working with these people, honest truth, does everybody really have something to say? Or
No.
and also, are there some people who just cannot cross that public speaking line, if you will?
God, yes. I mean, people think that you're teaching. I remember I sat next to a moral philosopher at a wedding once. And when she found out that I was a media trainer, the first thing she said was, so you're teaching politicians how to lie. And I said, no, actually. I said, that's a really small part of what this is. And I don't teach people how to lie anyway. Ethically, that wouldn't be what I was teaching them to do, or to even avoid the nasty questions. I said, most journalists' problem is that people are boring and that they can't take what they know and put it in a way that is really clear and effective. And, we were discussing just before you hit record that in journalism and broadcast, a lot of the time we do people and we de-breath them. And so as a result, what happens is, certainly with traditional media and to an extent with podcasting, I mean, we can talk about that later on, that the whole media ecosystem has given this impression that everybody is really great at communicating, that they come out very succinct, very crisp, that they know exactly what they want to say, that they're completely intentional the whole time because of how we edit it and how we cut it. And this is just not how the case is. Most of my life is not about getting people from silver to gold standard. It's probably from getting them from mud to bronze in a lot of cases. This isn't so, and that's okay. That's how some people are only ever going to be. It's more about, okay, we're going to put you into a neat structure. You're never going to set the world on fire, but you're not going to be a disaster either. And then you tell the person who's hired you, look, don't put this person out if you don't have to. And then some pick it up and they run with it, and it's absolutely amazing. And they pick up all the skills. They incorporate feedback unbelievably quickly. And they just make it happen. But it is hard. And people have this idea that, communicators like Barack Obama didn't put in any work, which is just nonsense. So, there are people who excel and there are people who just cannot get there. And I think it is partly to do with the fact that people are very smart and they don't necessarily know how, to connect the dots or make the story. I also think it's that people don't understand that you really have to practice aloud. You have to say it, right? If it's spoken communication, you have to talk it through, because otherwise you do all the kind of stuff. And most people's first thoughts are not the most interesting.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in front of a mirror when I was in my teenage years practicing my future career. I'd imagined it. I said, this is what I'm going to do. But I was speaking out loud and trying to emulate what the people that I liked on TV, and said, okay, this is how I want to sound like. So that's on the public speaking skills. But what about messaging? Does everyone have a message? Or do you just go, sorry, you probably don't need to say anything at the moment?
So, well, one of the things that we talked about in advance when we were discussing me coming on was I just didn't want you to use the word journey. And I think that this is the challenge that we have, especially in the age that we're in now of everybody has to promote themselves. Everybody's a creator. We hear journey. The word journey is so overused in terms of everything. Everybody's life is a journey. There's the baby journey, the marriage journey, the career journey, the mental health journey, the neurodivergent journey, which we all have to greater or lesser degree, depending on who we are. And as a result, I think what this idea of journeys does is it encourages us to sort of storify and sort of look for these points in our lives or in whatever we're doing to try and make them more meaningful to outside audiences than perhaps they are, or that somehow they're more transformational, or that they might be more interesting. I think the idea of it encourages self-absorption. So on the message part, most companies, even if they're boring companies, like they're making, business automation software, you can still have a good story or a good message in there if you say, look, we save our clients 30% of time and increase the amount of stuff that they would do for their customers and double their profits. That's a message. It may not be the most exciting, but you can get to that. Some people, and that's fine if that you can help them to find what problem that they're fixing and how they're doing it and what impact they have. That's not where most people start. Most people are very self-absorbed. They've drunk their own Kool-Aid. They just want to talk about everything they're doing or why their product is so shiny or so amazing. And they're not really thinking about how do you flip it so that you can connect it to what's going outside more broadly. And I think until you're basically able to help clients find that hook, which feeds into a wider social narrative, they're just going to have self-interest and products without any kind of story. And as you know, you're a journalist, we are wired for stories. Our brains need it. We crave it, especially when we have so much information and we need to be able to have shortcuts. If somebody doesn't give us a compelling story, we might look at them and go, okay, well, that's fine. But it doesn't stay with you. And again, it depends on why you want to communicate in the first place. And I think that's what really matters. If you want to be a good communicator, if you know that actually how you talk about your issues, what matters to you, then automatically you will do better than the people who just are there because they've been told there's a free sandwich with training.
Yeah.
But not everybody is inherently interesting, but you can make everybody more interesting than they are. It's a bit like the same thing, does everybody have a book inside them?
Yeah. Yes.
I remember I remember once I went to a creative writing class and the teacher said, I think everybody has a book inside them. And I said, yeah, but shouldn't some of those books just stay there? And she said, what a thing to say. And I said, well, I do think that, I said, I think there's a lot of people expressing opinions and sharing that's not terribly interesting.
I actually worked with an editor for a book who said within 30 seconds, she actually tells someone, you're not ready to write your book. Maybe you have one in you, but not right now. And so she would say that because it's just,
How about a blog?
Not yet. And you're right. Like everyone storyfies everything now. That I suppose, well, we have to, because our brains, as you say, we're wired for stories. But I think the point you're trying to make is that we have to link it to that wider narrative that is out there, and that is where people fail. Like they don't or struggle with.
Yeah, they don't link it out to something wider. They're not thinking about it in terms of what the audience gets from it. They are focused very much on who they are and what they do and how it's self-serving. And it's very difficult to get people to care about that if they don't have to. Yeah. And so the way I think about it is, I'm teaching people who have to communicate with people who don't have to listen to them. They're not paid to listen to them. They're not their teachers. They're not their juniors. They're not their customers. I'm teaching them to talk to much wider audiences, not just journalists, but also now it is also podcasts and things like that. But where you have to entertain people, there's a huge emphasis now on authenticity, which I think is one of the most overused terms in communication, because it implies that you don't need to prepare or that somehow the raw, unedited you is totally fine, which actually for most people it isn't. So I do think that unless you can actually show that you are somebody who is worth being in somebody's ears or in their inbox, and it's not just about buy my stuff or, here's what or the laws are that we're following or whatever. If hasn't got that lens that's focused on something broader, it's going to be very difficult to pull people in. And a lot of people just still don't think about their audience enough.
So what's your opinion on authenticity? Well, how do you define that properly?
Well, so authenticity is all back in vogue at the moment because of Donald Trump being re-elected in the United States. And there is an argument that goes, and I'm not fully convinced of it, that American voters hate Donald Trump, but they think he's himself, right, in an entirely unedited form. And therefore that even if they don't like what he says, they think that he has a coherent, organizing worldview that he was prepared to stand up for. And that they did not feel that that was the case with Kamala Harris, who they thought was a flip-flopper, that she was artificial, that they never really knew her. They never really knew who the real Harris was or what she thought. And so if we're going to take that as the point of departure, I'm saying if we're going to take that as the point of departure, their authenticity basically means, do we believe this person is really being themselves? And frankly, that is good comms, which is one of the reasons why I get cross with this idea of, oh, we're in the age of authenticity and you shouldn't have polished sound bites and it's not just about being really on message, it's that getting to know somebody and you have to be able to do this. Yeah, but you know what? If you were really contrived, if you had artificial mannerisms, if you had nothing interesting to say and you sounded really scripted, you were a bad communicator. It's not just about whether or not you were inauthentic. It's like, that is bad communication. So for me, I do think that it's important to not say anything that you don't believe because it shows up in your body language, not do any gestures that are artificial to you. So we've all seen the people who've been, overly hand gestured. Yes. And I also think it's important to give opinions where you can. So not to hedge on everything. So where, if you're asked a direct question, how much does it cost you to say yes or no? I think all of that matters. But I don't think it means turn up, do no prep, say whatever's in your head, spray, obscene racist rants against the wall, say inappropriate things just because you feel like it. Because sometimes audiences do like this, but I think that's a very specific kind of audience. And I think that for the rest of us, we do owe it to our audiences to bring the best version of ourselves, which usually does mean having thought it through a little bit. And yes, don't say anything or don't do anything that you don't mean, but you're entitled to choose what you want to tell people. Just make sure that what you're telling them is genuine.
Okay,
what do you think it means? What do you think it means?
Yeah, exactly that. I don't like, because people try to put authenticity on the same level as almost putting on another layer, which defeats the whole purpose of authenticity, or trying to come up with a story, somehow digging in a way that, as you say, comes out as contrived. I just think you've defined it perfectly. If you believe in something, say it and communicate that. And if you don't believe in something, don't even go near it. And also the opinion, I think that's where, for me, is a struggle in some ways, but I'm learning to have an opinion publicly, because as a journalist, I withheld, right? Especially with a political debate show, I was going to, correct people who were factually incorrect, but I am not gonna. Yeah, I'm not gonna give my opinion. So, but I do think people respond very well to vulnerability. Is, I think, part of authenticity, vulnerability, and also just taking a stand on something. I would probably not take, very strong stands on very controversial topics at the moment, because I still feel like I have that role of trying to bridge people where they don't understand each other. I want that. I want to be that person who tries to say, okay, hang on a second. I want to listen to where you're coming from. So I gave this example to somebody.
You're an interviewer. You're not being a guest. Sorry, I interrupted you just there. I totally understand where you're coming from this. I think it's really important that you can build bridges. I think it's more if you're being interviewed or you're the guest. It's then to have, actually, it's okay to say what your favorite beer is or whatever it is without worrying that you're going to offend.
Right. So I can interview very different politicians of the opposite beliefs, but I'm only inviting one of them to dinner. So I have the boundary personally in my personal life about the people I surround myself with. And maybe that's it doesn't matter what the opinion is, but it's the type of person they are. So, but as a journalist, I will always try to understand where they're coming from. even
Mm-hmm.
if their position is completely opposite to what I personally believe in. So I think that's where I stand on that.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Vulnerability is an interesting one,
Mm.
because certainly with the pandemic and Black Lives Matter and sort of some of the, how should I put, culture war issues that we've seen, you have seen much more pressure from sort of Gen Z and millennials, where they wanted their CEOs and their bosses to sort of be out there and have opinions on everything and to show emotion and be more vulnerable. And I think unfortunately this is way more art than science. And I'm of the view that I don't think CEOs should have opinions on everything. I think they should stay in their lanes, right, for a lot of stuff. I understand why there's pressure from their juniors, but I think it's very self-important and potentially problematic for the business if you come out with your opinion on everything. Vulnerability is much harder, because as soon as you say, oh, I need to make myself vulnerable, the act of doing it, as you have alluded to earlier, can actually just look really contrived and or manipulative. So there are always those hilarious LinkedIn posts about the guy who's taken a selfie of himself crying because he had to fire a bunch of people. But it was all about him. It wasn't about the people he'd had to fire, and he'd taken the time to look really sad. And so obviously that's an extreme example. But I do think even the act of making yourself vulnerable, or saying, I will put something out here, or the act of saying, I am going to show what I look like without makeup, or whatever it is, that is in itself a curated act, which automatically, the fact that you are doing it and you're making an editorial decision, it's a bit like observing particles in quantum physics. The minute that you do that, you change the reality of it in terms of the end product that you achieve. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a hard one. It's a really hard one, because looking at it from the other side, like for me, it's really hard for me to tell a personal story. And I always think, what for? Why would I do that publicly? I don't know. But at the same time, when I was going through hard times in life, what did I do? I reached out to people who were going through the same thing, but I would not have known that they were going through the same thing if they hadn't said something about it. And then that's how, I guess, communities form. And I would like to ask you about that later on as communication trends, because we're seeing so many changes at the moment. Before we get there, are you a good communicator about yourself and who you are? And what would your book title be?
Well, we talked about that before. So I think if I were going to go for the unspun version, it would be Hair on Fire. And if I were going to go for the spun version, it would probably be called the Out Breath, by which because I've had to learn how to manage that. So one of the reasons I'm not a good communicator about myself is that I have the grey filter on. So I've always been slightly depressive, very gloomy, pessimistic, and I've had episodes of depression throughout my adult life, and I was recently diagnosed as being ADHD and dyspraxic at the age of 45. Now, up until then, like a lot of people and a lot of women who get diagnosed later in life, you internalize a lot of the stuff that you're struggling with and you blame yourself. So your story about yourself is incredibly tough and brutal, because you always feel like you're not living up to your potential. So I always felt like I was a disappointment on paper, or that I just wasn't getting stuff done. I don't really have a very good prefrontal cortex. So basically, I'm not very good with planning or decision, sort of strategic decision making. So I always felt that I was just lurching around, not doing anything that was meaningful or adding value. I also came from a family where at one level, my father was incredibly proud of us, but my mother's very British, very hide her light under a bushel. She was a stellar academic, achieved huge amounts. You would never know it. She didn't talk about it. Very proud of us. We just did not come from a family where you talk about achievements, we're tough on ourselves. And so as a result, I personally don't think I'm good at talking about myself. I probably am much better at showing my brand when I talk about other people, or I try and fix their problems. So when I try and turn it outwards, I don't like talking about myself, which is weird, given what I do for a living. And I also don't like hearing other people say nice things about me. I find it really hard to take compliments. Yeah, I find it really hard. And I'm having to learn how to take it as I get older and to be more gracious, because I understand the intention. It's more that I just don't like it, because I actually feel that it creates pressure and I don't always agree with it. And also because it's actually not where I get my self-worth from. Okay. So I don't know. What was the intention behind that question?
Oh, I just wanted to know how you saw yourself and how you communicated and applied everything that you're helping others with on yourself. But I think you're right. The duality of it, we are harder on ourselves than we
Yeah.
are on
Well,
others.
there's
Yeah.
this story you have about yourself, and then there's a story that you put out publicly. So
Yeah.
I have always felt that there was a huge gap between what I presented and how I felt internally. And I know a lot of people feel like that, but I do also think that actually being neurodivergent has something to do with it. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So I could do the classic thing where, you know, I'd be on a 2-hour call like this with a CEO on the other side of the world. I'd knock them into shape because they were going on Bloomberg or whatever it was. I get paid a vast ton of money. I'd be done by that by 10 in the morning. And then I just waste the rest of the day looking at cat videos on Twitter or something, or I wouldn't get all the other stuff done. So I could be incredibly badass in a very short amount of time and sort of very high performing. And then the minute that stopped, I could just easily collapse into sort of slothdom quite quickly. And so I've always felt that there was this bit of a struggle between the two. And I'm sure there's plenty of people like that. I've got a friend who is the mother of a school friend of my son's, who's a complete badass professionally. Like, she's so good at what she does, totally different fields, but she runs her own business, absolutely kick ass. She has given me great advice in the past. And then one time when we went to the school for a school exhibition that both our kids had something in, I got a phone call as we were walking in, so my family, that said, look, could you take a photo of my son's exhibit for me? Because I'd forgotten that today was the exhibition and I've just brought them to school and I'm in my pajamas, so I can't come in. And so this is kind of what I totally relate to that, but that's kind of how I feel like there's one side of me that's like that. And then there's this sort of small, pristine window. And it's like, I'm very careful about what I put on my social media because obviously I work in communication and I'm allergic to most of the stuff that I see in my feed. So it needs to pass the test that I set it. But in terms of my own self, I have always felt that I was disorganized, chaotic, dyspraxia, for people who don't know what that is, it is a neurodivergent trait, but it is different from ADHD or attention or autism. It's sort of in the same family as dyslexia. And basically where it sits for somebody like me is that my brain has problems processing visual information. And in my case, that comes out in things like poor spatial awareness. I have terrible handwriting, so there's a huge hand-eye coordination thing. I find gestures are a problem for me. So I can't sew, I can't decorate cakes. My presentation of food is terrible. I have problems doing DIY. Wow. But a lot of the reason I'm saying this is because a lot of this was the stuff that when I was growing up, and probably when you were growing up, little girls were expected to be good at. So neat and tidy, colouring in the lines. You know, my art stuff was always taken out and helped after class. I didn't know this. My teacher told my mother at the time. But of course, we were just told that if we tried harder, then we'd be better at it. And of course, I couldn't do it. And so I think a lot of the story that I took with myself throughout my teenage years and into my 20s and into my adult life has been the story of just sort of chaos and mess and things like spatial. I don't see mess. So I've always felt that there was this part of me that was in some way defective. And it's only at the age of 45 that I'm actually sort of taking that step back and going, okay, let's not feel sorry for yourself here, but this wasn't your fault. And that does actually change a lot of the stuff. Now, I don't know if it's going to change how I talk about myself, but I do think it explains one of the reasons why I talk about myself the way I do, or why I have such a sort of discomfort with how I think other people might see me and how I feel internally, because it has always felt like, as I said, everything's on fire.
You know, even as you were telling that, and by the way, thank you for sharing that, I do want to know how you feel about talking about it now, because you are talking about it, and also that from my point of view, you have so much confidence. You're an empowered person. And is that how you actually feel?
Yeah, a lot of the time I do. No, so I mean, everybody's contradictory. So it's not about insecurity. Okay, I think that's one of the things that's important to understand. It's more about just having cycling moods, feeling like you can't cope, getting overwhelmed really quickly, not being able to, being easily distracted, not being able to tidy up, not being able to plan, not being able to stick with anything. And so it's not that, to me, yes, everybody feels insecure about certain things or that they have imposter syndrome. It's more just this kind of state that you feel like you're in a lot of the time, or that you have failed to achieve certain things because you literally could not sit down and get it done. But I'm also bloody minded, and I get that from both of my parents. And I'm also quite despite having been, I went to elite girls boarding school in the UK, and then I went to Cambridge University, and then I worked in places like CNN and the BBC. So you could say I'm the ultimate British establishment product. At the same time, I hate institutions, and I have quite an anti-establishment streak. And so I've never cared about climbing the 𝗀𝗂𝗃 pole, which is probably one of the reasons why I didn't care when I left the BBC. Like, I'm not interested in climbing the 𝗀𝗂𝗃 pole. I don't like the games. There was no, I didn't have a ruthless streak. So in that sense, I've always been quite happy to speak truth to power. And as a result, I do have that confidence because I will tell people what I think. I won't do it in a mean way. And there are just games I'm not interested in playing. So I do have that kind of inner reserve. A lot of my lack of self-confidence, well, not lack of self-confidence, but a lot of the kind of story about myself was much more that I just felt that I was in a vortex. And that, why was everything so untidy? Why couldn't I plan to this? Why couldn't I make a strategic plan for the business? Why did it feel like, even though I'd been doing it for 15 years and had great clients, that it just wasn't very professional?
And why are you sharing that now? What are you at a part of your, I don't like to use journey, but where are you in this whole process?
So I think partly having got this diagnosis, and actually I think the dyspraxia has been more damaging for me than the ADHD. The reason I even went to get diagnosed in the first place was because my sister knows a lot about this stuff because her younger son is autistic, and he's at the closer end to cut off than Asperger's. Like, he's at the more he needs more support. And then both my brother-in-law and my older nephew have the inattentive kind of ADHD as well. And so my sister knows a lot about this. And she said, I think you've got dyspraxia. I think Dad has it as well. And I think you should go and get tested. So I went and looked up dyspraxia, and I was like, bloody hell, excuse me, if I'm not dyspraxic, then I don't know who is. And then the ADHD came out with that too. And then also on my father's side of the family, there was a lot of alcoholism in the generation above, which could, of course, be in the neurodivergence. So getting diagnosed and understanding that this is part of the family history and the genes and how we are has been massively helpful. But it's also helped me to really take stock of the reason I'm happy to talk about it, and I'm happy to talk about it now, is because once I got over some of the initial grief of being diagnosed late and sort of realizing that I'd spent a lot of time blaming myself and sort of feeling bad about it, I then sort of sat down and said, right, what am I going to make decisions about now that's going to make my life easier, that's going to help me move forward with my business, my personal life, my relationships? What do I need to do, and what am I just never going to be able to do? And what do I need to accept as just part of myself, not my fault? And you should tell people this, because actually everybody has something that they're struggling with, and you can just own it. So for example, now with my ADHD, if something's boring, it's not my problem. It's my view. That's just, I will find a way to deal with it if I absolutely have to. But if I'm struggling to pay attention to somebody who's being boring, I do not consider that to be my fault anymore. So that's why I'm talking about it, because I'm at a point where I'm using what I've learned to make decisions about what comes next. So for example, I'm in the process of automating as much of my business as I can, which I should have done years ago, but because I don't have a prefrontal cortex, it would seem, I've just been sort of floundering around doing everything on instinct. But now my assistant and I are like, okay, let's do this and this and this. And so we're just pushing that through. And part of that has come from the realization that it doesn't have to be like this, right? And that actually that might sound incredibly obvious and other people might have got there faster, but that's just not how my brain works. And so now that I've realized that my brain is a bit different in other ways from neurotypical people, I can make those shifts that I need and make those decisions. And I think the reason also to talk about it is it's what you said before. I come across as very composed, very self-confident. Yeah, sure. That doesn't mean you're not struggling in some way. And one of the things that I really like, especially as somebody who's struggled with their mental health, is how many of the Olympic athletes this year came out and talked about their mental health. So the winner of the 100 meters gold men's finals, Noah, I forget what his surname is. I think it's Lyle. I might be making that up. Noel something. Anyway, that shows you how switched on I'm about it. But he posted something just after he won his gold medal that said, I am ADHD, I struggle with depression, anxiety, some other things as well, and asthma, and don't let anybody tell you that this is what defines you. And so I'm kind of in that place now where just say, this is part of you. It's your identity. So do you even say I'm ADHD or I have ADHD? It's not an illness. It's just who we are. And that's why I think it's really important to talk about it, because it's just it's just a state, but a lot of people don't understand that it isn't more than just it's not being hyperactive. There are other things to it. It's just fundamentally we're wired for a different world.
And how does it affected your decision or change your decision making? If you can summarize the principle behind your decision making now, how are you different now that you've
Well,
accepted?
So, a couple of things. So, medication helps. So, for example, a lot of the really boring stuff that I just never wanted to do, like the sitting down and wrestling, I don't know, setting up a booking page, or trying to work out how I'm going to get one client document into a system or make things easier. Medication actually just makes you more bloody minded about doing it. So it doesn't make it easier, or in my case, or it doesn't give me, some people say that they get stimulant medication, so Ritalin or the slow release versions of it, and they sit down and like, oh, my mind is completely clear and focused and now I can write my masterpiece. Doesn't happen for me. But what it does do is on the stuff that I really don't want to do, that I know I need to do, that I really struggle with, so planning, the sort of how to organize to-do lists, knowing where to start, it kind of doesn't make it easier, but it gives you that grit to keep going with it and to push it through. So in that sense, at that sort of, it's made, with my decisions, it's made me more like a dog with a bone at pushing them through. And actually that's what I think it's really helped with. I think decisions are one thing. I think the grit to follow them is quite something else.
I want to look at 2024 for you. What stood out from a comms with AI coming in, with the way echo chambers function, with polarization, everything? 2024, what stood out for you?
It's a very good question. I think that I'm half American as well, by the way. So I am very influenced by political communication over there. And I also do think if we're talking about communication in general, so much of it is at some level led by what happens in the US, obviously, but also culturally, the differences between the US and the rest of the world became more stark. What do I think happened? I think I do think podcasts really went into a different level in terms of this realization that certainly in places like the United States, and I think we're going to see it more in places like UK, just people are not, how they're getting their information is even more fragmented than it used to be. And that it's less perhaps about people expressing themselves online. It's much like, what are they listening to? How are they consuming? And how do we measure that? And there's so much that we just don't know. And I think that's what's a little bit scary about it. I think that AI is still very much in its infancy, in the sense of people are still experimenting with it, but they're not using it necessarily in that strategic a way. I also wonder whether the generative AI story is hyped, as in, a lot of these big companies, it's in their interests to say it's the next big thing because they've bet their company's future on it. So I don't necessarily know. I certainly do see that there are some examples of how it can make everybody's lives easier. I'm not sure that that's necessarily where everybody's putting their attention. And I was actually talking to a friend of mine who's a journalist in a sort of senior, high-profile media outlet. And she said all their senior people are thinking about all the creative stuff they can do with it. She's like, I don't want it to do that. I want it to do my payroll and my timesheets and my, all of that. So I think we're in a very sort of early stage still of how people are working out how to use it. I think that it is going to get better, and I think it will get more used. I am on the fence about what its longer term impact is going to be on creativity, because I don't see, and I mean, as in, is it actually going to help us get better at that stuff? I think that, and then I think we're back to podcasts as well. I think it's just in terms of the fragmentation and obviously people leaving X. So I think what we're seeing is more splintering. I don't know if it's echo chambers or if it's communities. I think that people are reeling slightly, and the sort of, regrouping, particularly after what happened in the US elections and the fact that X has disintegrated for most people. So I don't have an answer to what is going to happen next year, other than I think we're going to get even more fragmented, and I think that's going to make it much harder to reach different audiences.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, because as a consumer, the way I consume information is completely different to what it was just a few years ago.
Yeah.
And I actively avoid the news sometimes, and that's coming from a journalist, because I just don't want to see it. And it frustrates me that we're just doing exactly what we did 10 years ago. Like, I could have aired my report from 10 years ago today, and it would be
Yeah.
exactly the same. And that's frustrating.
I mean, I think it is. And I also feel really sorry for a lot of journalists who really do see their role as the fourth estate, you know, in holding truth to power and
Yeah.
having very high, rigorous standards and fact checking and getting people. And, you know, yes, okay, people who watch the news regularly or read the news has always been a relatively niche, elite part of a population. But to watch even more of your news, you know, this sort of really well reported, high integrity, I'm thinking of the gold standard stuff here, like New York Times, to see a lot of that power ebbing away to podcasters with no accountability who make 100 times as much as they do. I appreciate that's where the market's going, but when it comes to the, you know, particularly as and former journalist, I do struggle with that yes, okay, give the people what they want, but sometimes also from a public service point of view, there's a reason why you need journalists, and I feel very bad for them because a lot of them do know they're in a mess, a lot of them don't. But what is the answer? What's the way out? There are a lot of high quality podcasts, though. I mean, you can be spoiled for choice. There are loads. Yes. I think it's more that if you have this idea that you can basically select, you know, I'm not on TikTok or Instagram because I have ADHD, and I know that those are like attention quicksand, basically. So I'm just not going on those. But, you know, if it's TikTok, you can have entirely your own algorithm. You know, it just curates everything that you're going to see. With podcasts as well, you can pretty much select exactly what you want to see and hear. I mean, I make a point of putting the news on just for 5 minutes every morning so that my son and I are listening to some of the same stuff just for those 5 minutes. So I think you can select really high quality stuff. And as a result, that becomes a problem because you think, oh, well, there's all this great stuff out there. And, you know, other people are having their, and then you realize that other people are listening to dramatically different stuff. And you've basically got your own narratives and your own worldviews about things. And I think that is quite worrisome. I do think journalism may have a bounce back when people realize that actually all the AI and all the sort of self-generated stuff, that there is a lot of dross. So I think a lot of the high quality journalism that really adds value, so stuff like The Atlantic, longer form, great programming, I think there's always going to be demand for that. I think some of the mid-tier stuff and a lot of that millennial media like BuzzFeed, Vice that we've already seen die, I think that will get cleared out. So I think there is some hope for journalism, but I think it will be much smaller.
Yep, it will be. But I also, from a societal point of view, I just hope, you know, I'm trying to do my little bit in that if anyone wants to do podcasting, I can help you ask better questions or be more open to an opposing view, you know, little things like that. You know, I don't know the answer to the industry question. I really don't. But there are a lot of people who are leaving the industry. There's a lot. We know that job cuts. We can see that happening. We don't know what to do with AI. In my last newsroom, we were using AI on a daily basis. We don't know what form that's going to take in the newsroom in the future. So yeah, I think I'm going to focus on just trying to do my little bit in helping that space, because I've already been through the frustrated bit of being a journalist and not seeing what I hoped I would see.
Yeah, I mean, this is a way I tend to think about what I do is I have some red lines about who I will and won't work with. And I also give a lot of my time away for free to causes that I think are good. And if I can help them tell their story better, then great. But yes, I honestly, I think anybody who makes predictions about where journalism is going is foolish. I do think that unfortunately, we haven't crested with podcasts yet, because I think we're going to see even more people who shouldn't be launching them, but they'll die because they won't be very good. So if you can do it, you know, you'll do God's work if you teach people how to ask better questions.
I hope so. I'm putting it out there. In the Philippines, we have this saying, I hope you have the tongue of an angel. So I hope what you just said would come true. In terms of what you're currently doing now, what do you want to talk about? Like, I want to bring it to you. What issues you care about? I know there's some causes that you care about or some new projects. What would you like to talk about in that regard?
So I am at a stage with my business and the kind of work that I want to do where, you know, the classic is we are what we give our attention to. So that's the quote. And I forget, who was it who actually said we are what we give our attention to? Damn it.
We need to verify. I don't know.
No, we can. It's like it's on the tip of my tongue. I can't pull it out. But we are what we give our attention to, and as a result, I think that for me, it's really important that I work with companies or organizations where even if they're not doing things that are 100% with my value system, that actually I think the question is, do they make the world a better place by existing? And is it important that their stories are part of the discourse? And so I'm at a step, but I also want to get paid, right? So I'm not all naive about it. And I'm at a point where, in terms of how I'm thinking, I still have the causes, whether, I do a lot of stuff with environmental NGOs. I've done a lot of stuff with mental health at a discount. I used to do a lot of work for free, and still do, with an NGO for British citizens living in the EU who are affected by Brexit. I'm still involved with that loosely now. So there's all of that pro bono piece, which I'm very happy to do. But in order to finance that, I need to have more of the higher ticket clients. And I have a lot of them already, but I need more of those ones to sort of cross-subsidize the ones that I want to do for free. And so for me, what I'm looking for now in terms of the decisions is, I am looking more to work with, whether it's sort of mature startups or even, recent unicorn companies that are really doing something, whether it's, I don't know, in cancer or, or green technology, or stuff that is genuinely creating real things that we need that will enhance the human good. That's kind of where I want to be at this point, because I am actually, unfortunately, without realizing it, I'm a bit of a capitalist. I do believe in state intervention, but I also believe that certainly in big international markets, it's economics that drive things. And therefore, you need to have the economics weighted in a way that actually is to the greater public good, rather than, just a free market where...
That's really well put. You are a good communicator. You communicate your ideas very well. And if you were to look at all the clients you've worked with, people in power, all these high stakes comms, what is something that they often get wrong, and that you wish more people, as a service, what should people know and you wish more people knew about communicating better?
That the difference between a mediocre and a good communicator is regular out loud practice. Okay. And busy people or senior people will find all sorts of reasons not to do it, because either they feel silly, or they don't have time, or they think they know the stuff in their head. And as a result, they'll do okay, but they never quite get there. And we've seen it for ourselves. The difference between somebody who's fine and somebody who's stellar is dramatic. And all that comes from is just talking it through regularly. And I wish more people would make time for it. And they all go, oh, yes, we will. And then they don't do it. So that's the thing that I wish they paid more attention to. It's not very glamorous, but it is one of my key things, is that if you want to be a better speaker, you have to speak it. And those words are not going to get themselves off the page and into your tongue on their own.
100%. With my journalism mentee, that's what we do for a few hours.
Right.
Talk. I'll give you a script, say it, or answer my question.
I was thinking of renaming the business Speak Your Brand, because I think a lot of people really don't get this point, that when you speak, you are representing yourself. Yes. Both at a personal and at a professional level, and your reputation will be judged by that. And so if you are not effective in that moment, it may not count against you if you don't do it that many, if it's one off, it's okay. But we've seen the people who consistently punch above their weights in the world of activism, politics, or NGOs, because they are so effective with how they tell those stories. And so I think that is the thing, that if you want to be that person, you have to put in the out loud rehearsal part, even if you feel really stupid doing it. And it doesn't mean learning a script by heart. It just means owning it, so that we really believe that it comes from you, which is, again, back to the authenticity point. And actually, I have one client where one of the slides that we use in their training, because we co-train them, is authenticity is practiced. And spontaneity is rehearsed. And it's not a paradox.
That's a great line. You should own it. You should own that line.
Unfortunately, I don't.
Oh, you don't?
No, it's theirs.
If we were to leave the listeners with something to think about, or challenge them on something, anything you would like them to walk away with after listening to you today, what would it be?
Okay, so this might sound like a curveball, but maybe it's not, based on what we've talked about already. Don't wait to be 100% certain about a decision. I have never, all my major life events, I have felt underwhelmed about or deeply uncertain. So buying a house, when my boyfriend, we did get married, but my husband and I had a serious crisis, which was a grey area. Buying a house, having children, the decision to, where to go with a business, all of this stuff, you don't have to have these alleluia transformational moments. Often just thinking it through, going, okay, there's a risk here. I don't know how I feel about this, but I'm going to just take it anyway and accept what comes with it. That is absolutely a fine way to feel. I think one of the most overvalued concepts that we are sold, particularly in Western culture, is certainty. And I think we grow up with this idea that we're supposed to feel a certain way about certain things. And I think you don't have to do that. How you feel is totally valid. Doesn't mean you should be paralyzed by indecision, but it does mean that you don't have to be completely fired up because you've been sold a load of ideas about how you're supposed to be, whether it's about becoming a mother, having a kid, starting a business, whatever. How you feel is fine, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't take informed action.
Laura, thank you so much. That was a great way to end this. Thank you for your time. Really happy to see you again after all this time.
Visit us in Brussels.
I might go next year, so mainly to get my stuff and move it over to this side of the world.
Well, good luck with everything you're doing. So I really appreciate that.
And thanks for making the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating so others can find the podcast. Thank you for your company and see you next time.